partly protected him, why he was allowed to write with a degree of freedom, whilst giving a degree of loyalist obeisance to these structures, and yet at the same time to remain outside them. The question has to be raised whether Evola's philosophy is consonant with the creation of a society, or whether it will become, if you like, a spirit of individualism. Evola was also involved at the beginning of his career in one of the most radical modernist movements of the 20th century, Dadaism, in Italy, and he produced some Dadaist paintings. Now this superficially looks quite extraordinary, but of course there was a strong interconnection between certain early modernisms and fascistic ideologies. The reason that he became involved in Dadaism is quite interesting, and of all things there is a talk on YouTube that lasts 4.5 minutes, in which Evola as an old man explicates why he was involved. He says the reason we got involved in these movements was to attack the bourgeoisie, was to attack the middle class, and was to attack middle class sensibility and sentimentality. The extraordinary, radical, anti-system nature of many radical right ideas, which is hidden in more moderate and populist variants, comes out staring at you full in the face in people like Evola. Many fascistic and radical movements of the right, of course, were peopled by adventurers and outsiders and quasi-artists and demi-criminals and religious mystics and madmen and people who were outside of the grain of mainstream life, particularly people who were socialised by the Great War, which many of them experienced as a revolution. Wyndham Lewis, who was strongly drawn aesthetically to modernism and politically to various forms of fascism, and was a personal friend of Sir Olswell Mosley, once said that for us the First War was a revolution, wasn't a war. We saw killing on a truly industrial scale. We saw the industrialisation of slaughter. And one of the interesting ironies of the Evololian, and in some ways Ernst Junger's position about war, is that although thinkers like them are regarded by pacifists and liberal humanists and feminists as warmongers, there's a distaste for mass war in Junger and Evola and the others, because it's the war of the ants, the war of the masses in blood and dung and soil and gore. There is nothing chivalric about a man being torn to pieces by a helicopter gunship when he doesn't even have a chance to get his Armalite into the air. Evola would prefer the doctrine of the champion. You know, when two medieval armies meet, and one enormous hulking man comes out of one army in full regalia, trained in martial splendour and arts, as the previous speaker discussed, in relation to the Norse tradition, and another champion emerges, and they fight for a limited objective that leaves civilization intact on either side, but the one that is defeated will obviously pay dues to the other. Now, this shows the extremely sort of Byronic, individualistic and aristocratic spirit that lurks in Evola's formulations. The way his work has come down to us, of course, is the way he lived his life and the books that he wrote. It's interesting that the Anglo-Saxon world has received his literature through translations by mystic and occultistic publishers in the United States about Tantra, about Buddhism, about Japanese warrior castes and traditions, about the Holy Grail, about Greco-Roman, High Christian, pagan and post-pagan, Europeanist and other traditions. Another radicalism about Evola is total unstuffiness and absence of prudery in dealings with sex. Evola wrote a book called Metaphysics of Sex. He regards sexuality as a primal biological instantiation through which the races of man were renewed and replaced, but at the same time he regarded it as one of the primary human acts, act of great energy and force that has to be channeled, has to be made use of, has to be transcended in and of itself. You have this odd commitment to Tantra, which is a sort of erotic extremism of occult excess, and a total opposition to pornography. Why? Because the one involves the commercialization of sex. The one involves money interrelated with sexuality. From this purely sort of primal perspective, money almost has no, unless a marriage is arranged between dynastic states or groups for particular statal purposes, which is fine, money has almost nothing to do with these areas of life. The disprivileging of money as the basis of everything, and the belief that the society that we have now is the result of the fact that every politician in all of the parties represented in the major assemblies, including radical right parties, essentially of a populist hue, believe in Homo economicus. They believe that man is an economic integer and nothing else matters. Immigration, it's good for the economy, don't you know? Mass movements of capital around the world at the flick of a button on a screen, in exchanges all around the globe, particularly in the Far East now, but also ubiquitously. It's good for the economy. Everything is based upon the freeing of people from prior forms of alleged servitude due to economic enhancement. The sort of doctrines Evola holds are not neo-medieval, nor are they a desire to return to the ancient world with certain modern technologies. In some ways, they are a return to the verities that existed before the modern world was created. One of the most substantial critiques of this type of thinking is the belief that the modern world is inevitable, that all cultures and races will modernise and are doing so at a great rate of knots, that skyscrapers and enormous megalopic cities are being thrust up in the Andes and the Far East, and even client Chinese-built ones will emerge in Africa and elsewhere, and that it will be onwards and upwards forever in relation to what we have now. There are grotesque problems with that, of course, because to give every human on this planet, irrespective of race, kinship, clime and culture, a middle American lifestyle, you will need 3 planets, 8 planets, 10 planets, or you may need them in order to give them that middle American feeling. The 3 satellite dishes, the condominium, the 3 sort of Chelsea tractors outside on the driveway, the multiple channel TV and so on. To give every African that, we will need many, many planets and many, many times the economic wherewithal that we have even at the moment. The interesting thing about Evola is that many issues that convulse people today, famine in the Third World, war in the Congo, HIV/AIDS, he would say, well, are interesting, of course, because they're things that are going on and everything has a meaning even beyond itself. But ultimately, they're unimportant. The number of humans on the earth doesn't matter to his type of thinking. Pain and suffering does not matter in accordance with his type of thinking. Indeed, he welcomes it as part of the plenitude of life, because life begins in pain and ends in pain. And most people live their entire life in the denial of the fact that life is circular, as his philosophical tradition believes the world is and meaning is. There is progression round the circle, but there is decline. And decline and death are part of an endless process of will and becoming. It is essentially, and in a very cardinal way, a religious view of life, but also a metaphysically pessimistic and conservative view of life in a profound way that the conservatism of contemporary liberal Tories like Cameron would almost not even begin to understand. To a man like him, theories of Evola's sort are lunacy. Are lunacy, quite literally. The return to the Dark Ages, the return to the Middle Ages, quasi-justifications of slavery, quasi-justifications of the Waffen-SS. This is what Cameron or his colleagues on the front bench, and his even more liberal colleagues on the same front bench, would say about these sorts of ideas. But the irony is that 300 to 400 years ago, most civilized structures on Earth were based on these ideas, that even the modern ones that replace them are based upon the contravention of these sorts of ideas, which means they realised they were real enough to rebel against in the first instance. And it's also true that even in the high point of modernity, post-modernity, hyper-modern reality, all the phrases that are used, when a war occurs, when the planes go into the towers in New York, when the helicopter gunships stream over Arabian sands, you suddenly see a slippage in the liberal verities and in the materialism and in some of the ideas which are used to justify these sorts of things. Not much of a slippage, but you suddenly see a slippage, what occultists and mystics call a rending of the veil, a ripping of the veil of illusion between life and death. What life is really about. Is life really about shopping? Is life really about making more and more money? Is life really about bourgeois status when one already has enough to live on? Is life really about eating yourself to death? These are the sorts of things that Evola's viewpoint pushes before people, which is why the majority will always push it away. Its political texts are essentially revolt against the modern world, men amongst the ruins, and sort of riding the tiger. which explore the nature of a man who is born now when most of the prior traditions of his culture and his civilization have collapsed.